I was sitting at my own kitchen table, the one Frank built with his hands back in 1987, when my daughter slid a glossy brochure across it like she was dealing a card in a poker game she already knew she'd won. On the cover was a photo of 6 elderly people sitting around a table, smiling at a bingo card like it was the most joy a human being could possibly hope for at the end of their life. The brochure said, "Willowbrook Senior Living, where golden years shine." I remember staring at it for a long moment before I even looked up at her face. "Mom," Renee said, and her voice had that careful, rehearsed tone people use when they've practiced something in the car on the way over. "We just think it would be good for you to have people around. Structure. Somebody checking on you. My name is Marilyn. I'm 74 years old, and at the time this happened, I'd been a widow for 4 years, living alone in a 3-bedroom house on the east side of Cleveland that I'd raised 3 kids in. And in that moment, sitting at my own table, in my own kitchen, with the smell of coffee I'd made that morning still hanging in the air, I understood with total clarity that my children had already decided something about my life, and this brochure wasn't really a suggestion. It was an announcement. I want to back up a little because you need to understand how we got there. Frank and I had 38 years together. He worked at a machine shop off Lorraine Avenue for most of his career. Came home every night smelling like metal shavings and Marlboro Reds. And every single Friday, he brought home a bag of White Castle sliders because that was our tradition, ridiculous as it sounds now. We had 3 kids, Kevin, the oldest, then Danny, and then Renee, who came along almost 7 years after Danny. Kind of a surprise, but the good kind. Frank had a heart attack in his sleep on a Tuesday in March, 4 years before that brochure ever touched my table. He was 69. No warning, no history of heart trouble that we knew of, just gone. I woke up next to him and he was cold. And that's a sentence I still have trouble saying out loud, even now, all these years and one ocean away. After Frank died, I kept the house. The kids all offered in that first year to have me move in with one of them or move closer, but I wasn't ready, and honestly, I don't think any of them were fully serious about it either. Kevin lives in Columbus with his wife and their 2 teenagers, and their house doesn't exactly have a spare bedroom sitting empty. Danny's out in Denver, works in software, flies back maybe twice a year. Renee stayed local in Lakewood, about 15 minutes from me, married to a good man named Curtis, 2 little kids of her own. For about 3 years, I did fine, better than fine, honestly. I had my routine. I went to the Giant Eagle on Tuesdays because that's when the senior discount hit. I still drove myself everywhere. I had my church group, a handful of women I'd known for decades, and we'd do a potluck once a month that rotated houses. I gardened in the summer, tomatoes mostly, because Frank had built me raised beds out back before he passed, and tending them felt like tending him in a strange way. Then, about 8 months before that kitchen table conversation, I fell. It was nothing dramatic. I was reaching up into a cabinet for a mixing bowl, lost my footing on the little step stool, and went down hard on my left wrist. A common fracture for someone my age, the ER doctor told me. I was in a cast for 6 weeks. And during that time, I genuinely did need help. Renee came by most days, brought groceries, helped me shower without getting the cast wet, the whole thing. And I understand now, looking back, that this is the moment something shifted in my children's minds. I went from being Mom, who's doing great on her own, to Mom, who fell and could have hit her head, could have been lying there for hours. What if next time it's worse? I don't blame them for the fear. I really don't. I raised these kids to love hard and worry hard, and that's exactly what they were doing. But fear makes people do things that don't match the size of the actual problem, and that's what happened here. By the time my wrist healed, they'd already had at least 2 phone calls among themselves that I wasn't part of. I know because Danny let it slip once, months later, during an argument, that we talked about this as a family already, Mom, back in the fall. As a family, without me. That still stings a little, if I'm honest. So there I was in February, sitting at my kitchen table with 3 of my 4 adult children. Kevin had flown in for it, which should have told me how serious they considered this. And a brochure for a senior living facility sitting in front of me like a verdict. I fell one time, I said, 8 months ago. I've been fine every single day since. It's not just the fall, Mom, Kevin said. He'd always been the one who spoke like he was presenting a case, ever since he was a kid arguing for a later curfew. It's the house. It's a lot of house for one person. It's the stairs. It's you not having anyone close by if something happens. Renee is 15 minutes away. Renee has 2 kids and a full-time job, Kevin said, not unkindly, but firmly. We can't ask her to be your emergency contact for the rest of your life. I looked at Renee and I saw something in her face that told me this part, at least, had been discussed too. My own daughter, who I'd never once made feel burdened by me, at least not intentionally, looked down at the table. We toured Willowbrook last week, Danny said. It's actually really nice, Mom. They've got a pool, a movie night, a whole calendar of activities. You'd have people your age around all the time. And here's the thing that really got me, that I've turned over in my mind 100 times since. Nobody in that conversation asked me what I wanted. Not once. They'd already toured the place. They'd already had the family meeting without me. They'd already, in their minds, decided the outcome. And this conversation at my kitchen table wasn't a discussion. It was them informing me of a decision and hoping I'd go along peacefully. I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about villains. My kids love me. They were scared, and scared people sometimes do controlling things because control feels like safety. But in that moment, what I felt wasn't love. I felt like a problem being managed, like a file that needed to be closed out so everyone could stop worrying. I'm not moving into a facility, I said. Mom, just look at the brochure. I looked at it. I saw the smiling people playing bingo. I don't want to play bingo, Kevin. I want to live in my house, in my garden, with my friends from church. And I want you all to trust that I know my own body and my own life. The conversation went on for another hour, and it got harder before it got anywhere close to resolved. There were tears, Renee's mostly, and I think some of mine too, though I tried to hold them back, because I didn't want to give them ammunition, didn't want them thinking I was becoming emotional in some way that would fit their narrative of decline. Kevin brought up cost. Willowbrook was actually expensive, nearly $4,800 a month for a 1-bedroom unit, which he said could be partially covered by selling the house. Danny brought up statistics about falls and elderly people living alone, numbers he'd clearly looked up beforehand. At the end of it, nothing was decided, not officially. I told them I needed time to think, and they left that evening with a kind of tense, unresolved energy hanging in the house that hadn't been there since Frank's funeral. But something had cracked open in me that night, because for the first time since Frank died, I felt truly, deeply afraid. Not of falling, not of being alone, but of losing control of my own life to people who thought they knew better than me what my remaining years should look like. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in Frank's old recliner in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside me, and I thought about what a life at Willowbrook would actually look like. Waking up in a room that wasn't really mine, eating meals on a schedule set by someone else. Bingo. Movie nights I didn't choose. A calendar of activities designed by a 26-year-old activities coordinator who'd never met me and didn't know that I hated crossword puzzles and loved crime documentaries, and had once, in my 30s, taken a solo road trip to Niagara Falls just because Frank was working a weekend shift and I wanted to see it for myself. I thought about how much of my identity, my whole self, would just quietly disappear into that building. I'd become Marilyn from room 214 instead of Marilyn, who raised 3 kids and buried a husband and grew the best tomatoes on the block. And somewhere around 1 in the morning, sitting in that recliner, I picked up my phone and typed something into Google I'd never thought to type before. Cheap places to retire outside the United States. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I think part of me just wanted proof for myself more than for anyone else that there were other options in this world besides a facility with a brochure and a bingo table. I clicked through a few articles: Mexico, Portugal, Costa Rica, the usual suspects you see in those retirement magazines. And then I found a forum post on some ordinary-looking website where a woman named Carol from Michigan had written a long post about moving to a town in Vietnam called Hoi An after her husband passed. I read that post twice through. She talked about renting a small house near the beach for $380 a month. She talked about her health insurance costing a fraction of what it did in the States. She talked about her neighbors, a Vietnamese family who brought her fruit from their garden every week, about riding on the back of a motorbike taxi to the market, about a community of expats her age who met for coffee every morning at a little place by the river. She wrote one line that I copied down onto a notepad I still have, sitting right here next to me as I tell you this. I came here broken and scared of getting old alone, and I found out that getting old doesn't have to mean disappearing. I sat in that recliner until nearly 3 in the morning, reading everything I could find about Americans retiring in Vietnam. I found Facebook groups, expats in Da Nang, retiring in Hoi An, things like that, full of people my age and older, posting photos of themselves at beach cafes, at markets, at little parties thrown for each other's birthdays. I found cost breakdowns, healthcare comparisons. I found a man named Gerald from Texas who'd written an entire blog about his cataract surgery costing him $600 total, done at a private clinic in Da Nang, versus the nearly $4,000 quote he'd gotten back home, even with Medicare. By the time I finally went to bed that night, something had shifted in me. I wasn't planning a move yet, not really, not consciously, but a door had opened in my mind that I hadn't known existed. And once you see a door like that, you can't quite unsee it. Over the next few weeks, I didn't say anything to my kids about what I'd found, partly because I wasn't sure yet myself what I was even considering, and partly, I'll admit, because some small, stubborn part of me wanted to have a real plan before I brought it to them. Something solid enough that they couldn't just wave it away as a crazy idea their grieving, aging mother had cooked up alone at 1 in the morning. I kept researching. I joined a couple of those Facebook groups quietly, just reading at first, not posting. I learned about the visa situation, how Americans typically handled it through a business visa renewed periodically, or through a local agent who managed the paperwork for a reasonable fee. I learned about the weather, hot and humid most of the year, a rainy season in the fall, but nothing like the bone-deep gray cold of a Cleveland winter that had been aggravating my joints for the last decade. I calculated on a piece of paper what my Social Security check and Frank's small pension would actually be worth in a place where rent was $380 a month compared to the property taxes alone I was paying on my Cleveland house, which had crept up over $4,200 a year, plus heating bills that hit $300 some winter months, plus a roof that needed replacing at an estimated $11,000 that I'd been putting off. The math frankly stunned me. I could live in Vietnam comfortably, by every account I was reading, on less than half of what I currently spent just maintaining an aging house in Ohio. A house that 3 of my children thought I should abandon for a facility that cost $4,800 a month anyway. If I was going to leave my house regardless, and it was becoming clear to me that some kind of change was coming, whether I liked it or not, why would I trade my independence for a facility when there was another option that offered me more independence, not less, at a fraction of the cost? I want to be honest with you, though. It wasn't just about money, and it wasn't purely a rebellious reaction to my kids either, even though I'd be lying if I said that spite didn't play some small motivating role in the early days. The real thing that pulled at me, that kept me up reading forum posts until my eyes hurt, was this feeling that I still had life left in me. Real life. Curiosity. A desire to see something new before I died, instead of just managing my decline in a building with fluorescent lighting and a bingo schedule. Frank and I had never traveled much. We talked about it, always someday, always after the kids are grown, always after we save a little more. And then he died at 69, and someday never came for him. I was 74 years old, technically in good health, apart from a healed wrist and the ordinary aches of getting older. And I realized, somewhere in the middle of all that late-night research, that I still had a someday available to me, and I'd be a fool to hand it over to a facility just because my children were scared. About 5 weeks after that kitchen table conversation, I called Renee and asked her to come over, just the 2 of us. I figured I owed her the first real conversation, since she was the one closest to me, the one who'd been quietly carrying the most guilt through all of this, even though she tried to hide it. She came over on a Sunday afternoon, and I made coffee, and I sat her down at that same kitchen table, and I told her I wasn't going to Willowbrook. Mom, we already talked about this. I know what we talked about. Now I want to tell you what I've decided. And then I told her about Vietnam. I watched her face go through about 4 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like she wanted to laugh, and then underneath all of it, a flicker of real fear. Vietnam, she repeated, like the word itself was foreign in her mouth. Mom, you've never even been out of the country, except that one trip to Canada with Dad. I know. You don't know anyone there. You don't speak the language. You're 74 years old. I know that too, Renee. She sat there for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table. And then she said the thing that I think was really underneath all of her fear. The thing none of them had said out loud in that first conversation. I'm scared something's going to happen to you, and you're going to be alone on the other side of the world, and none of us will be there. And I understood right then that this whole thing had never really been about bingo, or facilities, or brochures. It had been about my children's fear of losing me the way we'd lost Frank, suddenly, without warning, and feeling powerless to have prevented it. Willowbrook wasn't really about giving me structure. It was about giving them a sense of control over something that terrified them. the fact that their mother was aging, and someday, in some way, she would leave them too. I reached across the table and took her hand. Honey, I could fall down my own basement stairs right here in Cleveland and lie there for 2 days before anyone found me. Distance isn't really the thing that keeps a person safe. And I need you to trust that I've thought about this more carefully than any decision I've made in years. She didn't agree with me that day, not even close. But something in her posture softened, just slightly. And before she left, she said something I've held on to ever since. Just don't do anything permanent yet, please. At least go see it first. And that, it turned out, was exactly the plan I already had in mind. I booked the ticket 11 days later. One round-trip fare, Cleveland to Da Nang with a layover in Seoul. $1,140. 3 weeks in country, return date already set so nobody could accuse me of running off. I told Kevin and Danny it was a trip, nothing more. And I let them believe, if they wanted to, that this was me humoring their concerns by getting it out of my system. I didn't correct that assumption. I just packed a suitcase, printed my boarding passes at the library, because I still didn't fully trust doing it on my phone, and on a Thursday morning in April, Curtis drove me to Hopkins Airport while Renee sat in the back seat looking like she was sending me off to war. I'm not going to pretend the flight was easy. 22 hours of travel time all told, my knees swollen by the time we landed, and somewhere over the Pacific, I had a solid hour of doubting every decision that had led me to that seat. I thought about Frank a lot on that flight. I thought about how he would have loved this. He was the one who always wanted to see something new, and here I was, finally doing it, 4 years too late for him to come along. Da Nang hit me the second the plane doors opened, before I'd even reached the jet bridge. The heat came in like a wall, thick and wet, carrying a smell I couldn't place at first, something like diesel and flowers and rain all at once. Carol was there to meet me at the airport, holding a little handwritten sign that said Maryland, even though we'd exchanged photos, and I nearly cried right there at arrivals, seeing a stranger's face who already somehow felt like a friend. Carol was 71, from a small town outside Grand Rapids, and she'd been in Hoi An for almost 3 years by then. She drove me, or rather her motorbike taxi driver drove us both, me clinging to the back rail like my life depended on it, which, admittedly, it kind of did, the 45 minutes down to Hoi An, and I watched rice paddies and roadside noodle stalls and water buffalo pass by the window like something out of a documentary I never expected to be living inside. She'd arranged for me to stay in a small studio above a tailor shop on a quiet lane just off the main tourist stretch, a 2-minute walk from the Tubon River. $340 for the month, fully furnished, air conditioning included, a little balcony with 2 plastic chairs. My landlord was a woman named Mrs. Lean, maybe 60 years old, who spoke almost no English but communicated entirely through gestures and an enormous gap-toothed smile, and who left a bag of fresh dragon fruit outside my door the very first morning without a word of explanation. The first few days, I'll be honest, were disorienting. The jet lag alone had me waking at 4 in the morning and exhausted by early afternoon. The traffic terrified me, motorbikes coming from every direction with what looked like no rules at all. Though I came to understand there was actually a rhythm to it, a kind of flowing logic that made sense once you stopped trying to apply American driving rules to it. And the language barrier produced its share of embarrassing moments. On my second day, trying to order what I thought was a simple iced coffee at a stall near the market, I somehow ended up with a glass of what turned out to be salted lime soda. which was not at all what I expected, and which the woman running the stall found absolutely hilarious once she realized my confusion, laughing so hard she had to sit down on her little plastic stool. But something happened around day 5 that changed the whole trip for me. Carol took me to a morning coffee gathering by the river. A loose group of 10 or 12 expats, mostly Americans and a couple of Australians, who met most mornings at a cafe called FIFO Coffee near the Japanese covered bridge. I sat there with my iced coffee, a proper one this time, watching the river traffic, the little wooden boats gliding past, listening to these people my age and older talk about their lives here with a kind of ease and contentment I hadn't heard from anyone back home in years. Gerald was there, the man from the cataract surgery blog, 78 years old, originally from Amarillo, missing most of his left hand from a farming accident decades earlier, but sharp as anything and funnier than half the men I'd known my whole life. He told me about his surgery in detail, about walking into Huan Mi Hospital in Da Nang with no appointment and being seen within the hour, about the entire procedure, both eyes, costing him $600 total, cash, no insurance paperwork, no 6-month wait list. Back in Amarillo, he told me, I was quoted almost $4,000 with Medicare picking up part of it and a wait time of 5 months just to get the consultation. Here, I walked in on a Tuesday and had it done by Friday. I spent that first week mostly just observing, letting the place settle into me. I walked along Anbong Beach most mornings, just a 15-minute motorbike taxi ride from my studio, and watched the sun come up over water that was somehow warmer and calmer than anything I'd ever waded into on the shores of Lake Erie. I ate at a little kamga stall, grilled chicken over rice, seasoned in a way I still can't quite replicate at home, for about $1.50 a plate, and I started to understand why my calculations back in Cleveland hadn't been exaggerated at all. By the second week, I'd found myself falling into something like a routine, which surprised me more than anything else. Coffee by the river most mornings, a walk through the Central Market where I slowly built up enough courage and enough of the local phrases to bargain, badly but earnestly, for fruit and fabric. In the afternoons, when the heat was at its worst, I'd retreat to my little studio and read, or write postcards to the grandkids, or simply sit on that plastic balcony chair and watch the lane below, school children biking home, an old man selling banh mi from a cart, the tailor downstairs hand-stitching late into the evening, with the radio playing something in Vietnamese I couldn't understand but found strangely soothing. One afternoon, Mrs. Lean's granddaughter, maybe 9 years old, knocked on my door holding out a paper airplane and a shy grin, apparently having decided I was worth practicing her English on. "Hello, how are you?" she said, very carefully, like she'd rehearsed it. I told her I was fine, thank you, and asked how she was, and she looked utterly delighted that the exchange had worked and ran off giggling. Small moments like that kept happening, little threads of connection I hadn't expected, hadn't gone looking for, that made the place feel less like a vacation and more like the beginning of something. I visited a doctor during that second week, too, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to test the healthcare situation for myself before making any real decisions. I went to FB Hospital in Da Nang, a private facility that Carol recommended, and had a full checkup, blood work, an EKG, a consultation with an internist who spoke excellent English and spent nearly 40 minutes with me, more time than any doctor back home had given me in the last decade. Total cost, out of pocket, $85. I sat in the taxi afterward and just stared at the receipt for a while. By my third week, I wasn't the same woman who'd landed at that airport clutching the armrests in fear. I'd started looking at long-term rentals, not because I'd fully decided anything yet, but because I wanted to know what the options actually looked like. I found a small house not far from where I was already staying, on a quiet street across the Anhoy Bridge on what locals called Cam Nam Island. 2 bedrooms, a little garden out back, big enough for tomato plants if I wanted them, $410 a month, unfurnished, but with the landlord willing to include basic furniture for a small additional deposit. I stood in that empty house on my second to last day in Vietnam, sunlight coming through a window that faced east, and I thought about Frank's raised garden beds back in Cleveland, sitting empty this year because I hadn't had the heart to plant anything after February. And I thought, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, that I could plant something here instead, that this could be a place where I started over. Not because my old life was over, but because I still had room in me for a new one. I called Renee from that empty house, video chat, walking her through the rooms with my phone camera shaking slightly in my hand. "Mom, it's actually really nice," she said, and I could hear something in her voice. Not full acceptance yet, but the beginning of it, a crack of light getting through. It doesn't look like... I don't know what I was picturing. Somewhere sketchy, I guess. This looks like a real neighborhood. It is a real neighborhood, Renee. People live whole lives here. Good lives. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Just come home first. Finish the trip. We'll talk when you're back." I flew home 3 days later with a folder full of notes, photographs, a rental agreement I hadn't signed yet, but had asked the landlord to hold for me, and a decision already made in every part of me that mattered, even if I hadn't said the words out loud to anyone yet. The hard conversation, the real one, was still ahead of me. But for the first time since that brochure had landed on my kitchen table, I wasn't dreading it. I was looking forward to it, because I finally had something solid to bring to it. Not a rebellion, not a fantasy, but a real, specific, thought-through plan. And I intended to lay it out for my children the same way Kevin had laid out his case for Willowbrook, calmly, with facts, and without asking permission. I called all 3 of them within a week of landing back in Cleveland and asked them to come to the house on a Saturday. I told them I had something to share, and I could hear the wariness in Kevin's voice even over the phone, like he already sensed the ground shifting under him. They arrived that Saturday afternoon, and this time I was the one who'd prepared. I had printouts spread across the kitchen table, the rental listing with photos, a full cost of living breakdown I'd typed up myself, a page detailing the visa process, even a printed map showing exactly where the house sat relative to a hospital, a market, and the expat community I'd already started to know by name. I'd learned something from Kevin, whether he knew it or not. If you want to be taken seriously, you come to the table with more than feelings. You come with facts. "I'm not going to Willowbrook," I said, once they'd all settled around the table. "And I'm not staying in this house either. I'm moving to Vietnam." You should have seen my kids' faces when I said it. Kevin actually laughed at first. Not a mean laugh, more of a startled, involuntary sound, like his brain hadn't caught up to what his ears had just heard. Danny set down the coffee mug he was holding so hard it clinked against the table. And Renee, who already knew, who'd already seen the photographs on that shaky video call, just sat there watching her brother's reactions with an expression that was somewhere between vindication and dread, because she knew what was coming next, and she knew it wasn't going to be easy. "Mom," Kevin said once he found his voice, "that is not a serious option. You can't just move across the world by yourself at 74 years old." "I already went," I said. 3 weeks. I stayed there. I found a house. I met people who've been living there for years, happily, healthily, on a fraction of what it costs to live here. I saw a doctor there and got better care in 40 minutes than I've gotten in this country in the last 5 years combined. This is insane, Danny said, running a hand through his hair the way he'd done since he was a teenager, ever since something upset the careful order he liked to keep things in. You don't know anyone there. You don't speak the language. What happens if you get sick? What happens if something happens to you and we're 14 hours away? What happens if something happens to me here, Danny, and Renee's stuck in traffic on the shoreway, and Kevin's 4 hours away in Columbus, and you're a full day's travel from Denver? I let that sit for a second. Distance is distance. 14 hours or 4. If I fall and hit my head alone in this house, none of you are walking through that door in time to stop it. That was never really the argument, and I think you all know that. Kevin opened his mouth to argue and then closed it again, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but the recognition that the ground he'd been standing on wasn't quite as solid as he'd believed. We argued for nearly 3 hours that afternoon. There were moments it got ugly. Danny accused me of being reckless and selfish, said I was thinking about myself and not about what it would do to them if something happened and they couldn't get to me. That one stung because I understood where it came from, even as I disagreed with it completely. Kevin kept circling back to logistics, to worst-case scenarios, to insurance and emergencies and every possible thing that could go wrong, because that's how Kevin has always managed his fear, by trying to outplan it. But somewhere in the middle of all that arguing, something started to change. I pulled out the folder of photographs from the trip and started passing them around. The little studio above the tailor shop, the coffee gathering by the river with Carol and Gerald and the others, the empty house on Cam Nam Island with sunlight coming through the east window, and Bang Beach at sunrise. I watched Renee's face soften first, because she'd already started to soften weeks earlier. Then I watched something crack open in Danny, the engineer in him responding almost against his will to the actual numbers I'd laid out. The $85 doctor's visit, the $410 monthly rent, math that simply didn't compute against the $4,800 they'd been prepared to pay every month for Willowbrook. Kevin held out the longest. Kevin always does, but even he, by the end of that afternoon, had gone from absolutely not to, I still think this is a mistake, but I can see you've actually thought about it, which from Kevin was practically a full surrender. Just promise me one thing, Renee said near the end, her voice thick. Promise you'll let us come visit. Promise you won't disappear on us. Honey, I told her, I'm not running away from you. I'm running towards something. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. It took another 4 months to actually make the move happen, selling the house, which went faster than I expected, for $187,000, enough to comfortably fund years of a modest life abroad, even without touching Frank's pension or my Social Security. Sorting through nearly 4 decades of accumulated belongings was its own kind of grief, honestly, harder in some ways than I expected. I gave Frank's tools to Kevin, who'd never had much use for tools in his life, but took them anyway, I think because he needed something of his father's to hold on to. I gave the good china to Renee. I kept surprisingly little for myself. Some photographs, Frank's wedding ring on a chain, a small wooden box he'd carved for me back when we were dating, and not much else. Everything else went to donations, to estate sale, to the wind. The hardest goodbye wasn't with my kids, actually. It was with my church group, the women I'd shared potlucks and prayers and decades of ordinary life with. Dottie, who'd been my closest friend in that group for almost 30 years, cried so hard at our final lunch together that the waitress came over twice to check if everything was all right. You call me, Dottie said, gripping both my hands across the table. You call me every single week. You hear me? and I have every single week since, without fail. The day I actually left, Curtis drove me to the airport again, same as before, except this time there was no return ticket folded in my bag. Renee cried the whole drive there, quietly, the kind of crying that doesn't want attention drawn to it. Kevin had flown in the night before just to see me off, which meant more to me than he probably realized. Even Danny, who couldn't make it in person, called me from Denver while I waited at the gate, and near the end of that call, his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy, and he said, "I hope this is everything you think it's going to be, Mom. I really do." It has been, and then some. I moved into that little house on Cam Nam Island in September, just under 6 months after that brochure first landed on my kitchen table. I planted tomatoes in the garden out back within the first week, in soil that grows things faster and greener than anything I ever coaxed out of the Ohio ground. This is Lean's granddaughter, the one who'd practiced her English on me during that first trip, turned out to live just 2 streets over, and she still comes by most weeks to help me with my terrible Vietnamese in exchange for help with her English homework, a trade that benefits us both far more than either of us probably deserved. I settled into a routine that 4 years later still feels less like exile and more like the fullest version of my life I've had since Frank passed. Mornings start early, coffee by the river with Carol and Gerald and the group, which has grown over the years to include newer arrivals, a retired school teacher from Oregon, a widower from upstate New York, faces that keep changing, but a community that somehow keeps holding steady. I do Tai Chi 3 mornings a week with a group of mostly local Vietnamese grandmothers in the park near the market, none of whom speak much English, all of whom have adopted me anyway with a warmth I still find humbling. I tutor a small group of neighborhood kids in English twice a week, unpaid, purely because it gives my days shape, and because watching a child's face light up when a sentence finally clicks together is one of the purest joys I've found in this life. My total monthly expenses, even now, rarely climb above $950. Rent, food, the occasional tailored outfit, a housekeeper who comes twice a week for the equivalent of about $40 a month, motorbike taxi fares, everything included. I have a Vietnamese doctor now, Dr. Han, who I trust more than any physician I ever saw back in Cleveland, and who once, when I had a bad bout of bronchitis 2 winters ago, made a house call, an actual house call, because I mentioned I didn't feel well enough to travel to her clinic. There was one health scare, I won't pretend there wasn't. About 1.5 years in, I had a fall, nothing to do with the country, just plain bad luck, missed a step coming down from my own porch, and cracked 2 ribs. Renee got the call, and I know it was the exact nightmare she'd feared from the beginning, the exact scenario that had driven that whole conversation at my kitchen table years earlier. But Carol was at my house within 20 minutes. Gerald drove me to Huan Mi Hospital himself. I was seen, x-rayed, treated, and resting at home again within 4 hours. Total cost under $200, and I had 3 separate friends checking on me daily for the following 2 weeks, bringing food, sitting with me, refusing to let me feel even remotely alone. When I called Renee to tell her I was okay, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that told me everything had finally clicked into place for her. "You have more people checking on you there," she said, "than you would have had in that whole building back in Cleveland." So she and Danny came to visit about 6 months after that, their first trip, 2 weeks together with Renee's kids in tow, Curtis staying home to manage the dog. And I have to tell you, watching my grandchildren splash in the shallows at An Bang Beach, watching Danny sit at that same riverside cafe with Gerald, peppering him with questions about visas and healthcare costs with the same intensity he'd once used to argue against this whole idea, Watching Renee stand in my little garden and run her fingers along the tomato vines, climbing up the same kind of simple wooden frame Frank used to build back home. That was worth every single hard conversation that got us there. Kevin came a year later alone during a work trip that happened to route through the region. He'd stayed skeptical the longest, and I hadn't expected him to be the one most visibly moved once he actually arrived. But I watched him sit on my little balcony that first evening, a glass of iced tea in his hand, watching the lane below where the Taylor's radio still played faintly and the neighborhood kids still biked home from school. And he went quiet in a way Kevin almost never goes quiet. "I get it now, Mom," he finally said. "I really didn't before. I thought we were protecting you. I think we were just scared, and it was easier to call it protecting." I told him that was about the most honest thing any of my children had said to me through this whole ordeal, and he laughed, and something between us settled that had been unsettled since that morning the brochure landed on my table. I still don't know how many years I have left, of course. Nobody does at any age in any country. But I know that whatever years I do have, I'm spending them awake in a garden that grows things faster than Ohio soil ever could, among friends I never expected to find at this stage of my life, in a place that took me in without asking anything of me except that I show up, curious and willing to learn. My children didn't get the version of my ending made pictured that day at my kitchen table. They got something better, even if it took them a while to see it that way. And every single time one of them steps off that plane in Da Nang, and I watch their face shift from worry to something closer to wonder, I think of Frank, and I think, quietly, that he would have loved this too, and that maybe in some way I'm finally living the someday we always talked about and never got around to, for the both of us.